Welcome to Supply Chain 4.0, All You Need to Know, a 5-part podcast series powered by Procurious and sponsored by IBM Supply Chain. With so many dynamic changes happening in the supply chain profession, are you struggling to keep up with the latest trends? Never fear, because in this series we've got you covered as we address how to define where your supply chain begins and ends, how blockchain will improve your supply chain visibility, the latest technologies impacting your supply chain, and how to make supply chain management your organization's competitive advantage. Today I'm speaking with Roger Needham, supply chain consultant at IBM, on the topic of technology megatrends for 2020 that will impact supply chain management. We're really going to use this as a bit of a tutorial for you all because there's so many terms floating around at the moment. So given that we've got Roger here as our expert, Roger, we really just thought we would go through some of these terms and if you could give us a rundown on what they mean and what's happening.
Yeah, happy to, Tanya. Yeah.
Great. Thank you so much. Well, I guess, I think this is the umbrella term for everything that we're seeing happening in what we're calling Supply Chain 4.0 or the fourth industrial revolution. IoT, the Internet of Things. Tell us about that.
Yeah, I guess put simply, Tanya, and I guess this is quite a commonly used phrase now, the Internet of Things. So it's the ability of internet-connected devices to talk to each other. So I guess one of the familiar things we're all conscious of is the small devices we can have in our houses to summon commands and radio channels and look up things for us on the internet. So I guess that's probably the simplest way of looking at it. But alternatively, we can have devices installed within assets across the supply chain that can be used to monitor supply chain progress of an asset, whether that be a truck, a ship, a container, a returnable pallet, and so on and so forth. So it's the way those machines are connected to each other wirelessly within their own domain setting.
Is there something in those sort of devices, they can be wearable, they can be trackable, that has really captured your attention? Like, what's something that's happening in supply chain that you've found really fascinating within that category?
Well, I think there's two areas, Tanya. One is if we look at a sort of manufacturing process where I think the Internet of Things and connected devices has become quite well established between, say, robots within a factory. That's been going on for some time now. But what we're starting to look at is to say, well, how can we link those robotic devices into information flowing to the supply chain? So if you imagine the robots are within the four walls of the factory, that's one part of the manufacturing process, but none of that really works if the components required for assembly are not there. So what we're really excited to start to develop is just how we can combine the Internet of Things processes within the factory to what's flowing to the factory, and I'll probably cover that a little later on with when we talk about AI. And maybe another topic, just a quick one, is if you think of large pieces of capital equipment, whether it's agricultural machinery in the field or large mining equipment in mines, for example, there's the ability of the machine, the asset, to start to communicate using these devices and effectively deliver information around wear rates of components, potential failure of components, so that almost the machine is going to pre-order what's required before it fails. There's still work being done in that sphere, but I think that's a particular relevant example of IoT in the supply chain.
Managing its own maintenance, if you like.
In effect, yes. Yeah. The early days thereof, yes.
Yeah. Now look, blockchain, I'm a huge fan. I guess I just can see so many opportunities for the use of blockchain, and we're starting to see some very exciting things. Walmart with their food safety. We've obviously got the Maersk joint venture with the freight, and now slavery, of course. So can you run our listeners through, how blockchain works and how it's separate to cryptocurrencies and what you see the opportunity into the future for blockchain?
Yeah, I'm not sure I could go into a lot of detail around how it differs from cryptocurrency, but I think the message that we're bringing is how the sheer complexity of the transactions that exist within the supply chain. So if you think in its simplest form, a ledger is a log of all the transactions. The transaction just being, a transfer of an asset between different participants. That's the traditional trading mechanisms of old. But of course, with so many disparate partners in a complex supply chain, from suppliers, distributors, freight partners, customs agents, freight forwarders, and so on and so forth. The challenge has always been, do each of those parties have the same view of the transaction processes and the transaction log? So what blockchain is really doing is providing a technical process whereby, as a transaction takes place, the record is updated and is effectively there for all participants who have agreed to be part of the blockchain and have met certain criteria. It then becomes an immutable version of the truth. So it will help to avoid future dialogue around, well, I shipped this, no you didn't, I only received that, and so on. So that, in its simplistic form, is the starting point for blockchain. I guess the challenge for the industry in supply chain is just working out whose particular version and template is going to become used. And I think that's where I'm detecting a little nervousness within supply chain professionals, just that sort of holding back and waiting to see. I guess it's almost like that old
predominant.
Yeah, it's almost like that old. I don't, some listeners may remember the old VHS and Betamax video dilemma. Which one was going to win? So it's in my non-technical mind. I should add that I'm a supply chain individual, not an IT specialist. That's how I see things in my non-IT world.
Yeah. And I think, for so many years now we've been worried about transparency within the supply chain because we do have such extended global supply chains with so many players. And I think, something like blockchain really gives us that opportunity to be able to identify the partners and transactions going back so many layers. So, that's why I'm excited about it. Now, RPA, you gave us a little insight earlier to the opportunity of having sort of robotic process automation on the shop floor. So can you give us a rundown on RPA?
I mean, I think when you use this sort of the term RPA, I think there's some processes. For example, you think of a warehouse with its process of updating of receipts as product comes into the warehouse and is put away. That's one particular area. The other one, I would say, just in terms of the complex process of receiving and approving and logging of invoices. So anything where the task that would be done by a human is, relatively very repetitive, has to be transacted in bulk. That's where the robotic process automation can effectively mimic the processes undertaken by humans. So I think there's a generally accepted that there are three types of these bots, software robots, if you like. So there's what we call the pro bots. So these are the bots that can just follow sort of simple rules to process data. So if this, do that. If the other, do the other. So very much a very step-by-step monotonous process that might, if the invoice is more than a pre-agreed amount, well, put it in this pile. If it's within an acceptable percentage, put it in that pile, and so on. And then that document can flow through a series of process bots for ultimate authorization at whatever level of the organization. So there's then what we call no bots. So they they're able to search the internet and gather and store, certain specific sets of information that have been predefined by the user. So that's another level of sort of thinking, if you like, and I put thinking in inverted commas. But then chatbots. So these are some of the ones that maybe a few of us are starting to see in the customer service environment, where you call on the chat, live chat device, some of which admittedly are operated by the good old-fashioned human being, and others are operated by bots. So even within IBM, within our own corporate portfolio, we have the ability to have an HR chat to ask simple questions around terms and conditions and that sort of thing. So they can respond to human language processes virtually in real time. And in terms of on the shop floor, I've not seen anything directly yet myself, but I can certainly think back to my time in warehouse management, where some of those monotonous process of booking receipts into systems, which has to be done with every load arriving, every pallet, every container, broken down and put away into a storage location. I can see where that type of technology can be used to supplement those repetitive tasks.
Fantastic. I think we probably know a few human no-bots and chat-bots as well, but that's not the topic for today. Now AI, I know a leading US professor said, AI is going to be the new electricity, and that really resonated with me because I know over the last few years there's been a lot of talk within our profession, and particularly on Procurious, about what does AI mean, but you can already see that it's just happening. It's in the background. Most, software programs we buy now has an element of AI in it anyway, isn't it? So we probably don't need to get too concerned about how it works. It's just, realizing the benefits and really embracing it. But, that's my view. Over to you, Roger. You're the expert. Tell us about AI.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with what you're saying. I think the challenge for any supply chain professional is almost, where do I start?
Yeah.
It's almost like you're stood at the bottom of a very, very steep cliff, and your neck is craning upwards, and you're thinking, never mind how do I get to the top? How do I take my first step? So this is something we've looked at in our technological suite within our own supply chain. So it's probably worth mentioning that IBM, contrary perhaps to popular belief, does have its own supply chain. We still make large servers. So we've explored how we can take that first step in the supply chain. And I think my advice to any supply chain professional is that, to use that well-used cliche, you're not going to boil the ocean. You're not going to implement any form of AI across your supply chain from day one. You really are going to have to look at some critical supply chain challenges that you face, very, very targeted and specific supply chain challenges, and work out, right, how can I use AI to help me work through the morass of data that is probably sits within the organization. And the first part of doing this is to say, right, let's recognize the types of data. Because AI is all there, its capability sits around its ability to process huge amounts of data in a very small time frame. So which data do you want the AI to look at? Clearly, you will have your own supply chain data that sits within your own ledgers, maybe spreadsheets, your ERP, databases. So that's the transactions that sit between you and your partners within your supply chain. And that in itself might be quite a challenge, depending on how well integrated or not your data is. But let's presuppose that set of data is reasonably accessible and you've got a good handle on where it is or perhaps who to ask for if you don't know where it is. The other data is all you think of all the potential factors that can impact your supply chain in the real world. Those external factors, weather disruptions, port strikes, pilot strikes, blocked roads, you name it. There are physical, geopolitical issues that affect supply chains all the time. And we've started to sort of look at AI and how we call it Watson can actually scan the internet, scan social media and all sorts of other news platforms to provide relevant information to a supply chain professional when they know there's a potential problem in the disruption of their flow, whether that's into their warehouse, into their factory, from their warehouse to their customers. So we are then providing in an operational center the ability to make real-time operational decisions with some appropriate supply chain information around you. So which orders are going to be impacted by this problem or this disruption? Which supplier shipments are going to be impacted? And if a supplier shipment is going to be impacted, which orders will be impacted further downstream? So, and then the third type of data is the data that we all possess as humans, our experience and knowledge that we've built up over time. And I'm sure many of the listeners would recommend or recognize stages in their career where they've moved on from one job to another, and they've taken that knowledge set with them.
Yes.
But the people left behind, if they faced a similar challenge, would start again. So there's an ability there for AI to learn with the human and create a set of almost digital, repeatable, referable playbooks, so that the supply chain professionals in the organization of the future have access to relevant scenarios that have played out previously. So I think the term I like to use, because as a human being, it's more comfortable. So rather than saying artificial intelligence, I think we like to use the term augmented intelligence.
Yes.
So that infers it's the machine working with the human at the right time, as conducted by the human, but allowing the human to do the more interesting roles, solve some of the more interesting problems, and then some of those day-to-day supply chain challenges can be monitored and highlighted by AI.
Thanks so much for joining us today, Roger. You've been listening to Supply Chain 4.0, All You Need to Know, a podcast series powered by Procurious and sponsored by IBM Watson Supply Chain. For more related content, please check out the Supply Chain Pros group on Procurious.